every day we're seeing the law erode under our feet, Trump making more and more outrageous, whimsical demands, and all of the institutions that could stop him caving before him. So that's a dictatorship.
Democrats and the American left in general have long feared Donald Trump's authoritarian tendencies, that they would come to the fore in a second term. And they've had plenty to worry about since he returned to the Oval Office in January. Ruled by executive decree, the roundup of undocumented migrants, questionable deportations, the deployment of the National Guard on city streets, revenge missions against his enemies, the sacking of those who disagree with him or give him unpalatable stats, a cabinet of like-minded sycophants, a cavalier disregard for the truth, even in official briefings. So the rap sheet is long, but throughout he's often been thwarted by the courts and closely monitored by largely hostile media. So authoritarian rule? To some extent. But dictatorial rule? Surely not. Kim Lane Scheppele is a professor of sociology at Princeton University. She thinks Trump is indeed a dictator. Let's speak to her now. So, Professor, a president with authoritarian tendencies, I think many would give you that. But a dictator? Surely that's a step too far.
Well, first of all, good to talk to you. And you had a very good list at the beginning of all the reasons why many of us think that we're already in this state. So I think here's the criterion to look at, which is that the reason why we fear and criticize dictators is that they rule arbitrarily, that you can't tell what they're going to do next, or that whatever they want to do, they get away with. And that's the state we're already in. Trump decides he wants to rename things. Trump decides he wants to bomb boats in the Caribbean, for example. He decides he wants to go after his enemies. The crucial thing here is that there's nothing stopping him. And yes, there are critics, and yes, the lower courts have tried to draw the line, but every single time the lower courts have tried to draw the line, and the government takes that case up to its packed Supreme Court, the Supreme Court says, go ahead, Mr. Trump, we have no trouble with what you're doing. That includes yesterday when the Supreme Court came down with a decision that allows ICE, which is our immigration police, to make stops of people just because they look foreign or speak a foreign language. That runs directly counter to Supreme Court precedent that existed, that we all still thought was good law until yesterday. So, every day we're seeing the law erode under our feet, Trump making more and more outrageous, whimsical demands, and all of the institutions that could stop him caving before him. So that's a dictatorship.
But he has lost in the courts, including in the Supreme Court. He lost, it ruled against his Guatemala and Venezuela deportation plans, his use of the National Guard in Los Angeles, his attempts to freeze Harvard funding, and his cuts to foreign aid. Now, no dictator would put up with that.
Well, he's not putting up with it. That's exactly the point. So, for example, that one on Los Angeles, the Supreme Court just gutted the decision of the lower court. That decision on Harvard, that's a lower court decision, and everyone expects the government to appeal it. So the lower courts are applying the law as it existed when Trump came into office, because they say he can't override the law with just saying so or signing an executive order. The lower courts are all on board with that, but the Supreme Court not. The only place where the Supreme Court stood up to him was in saying that before someone is just yanked off the streets and sent to a hostile foreign state to be imprisoned forever, that they have to have a hearing. But they reversed themselves on that just a few weeks later in a case that involved deportation of people to South Sudan, of all places, right? A place where the U.S. government doesn't even have an embassy because it's so dangerous. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, we kind of wish you had a hearing, but never mind if you didn't have a hearing to demonstrate that these people actually could be lawfully removed. So, the Supreme Court is actually aiding and abetting Trump in everything he's doing.
Some big decisions have yet to go before the Supreme Court. I mean, you said the turning point for you was the deployment of the National Guard in Washington, D.C. Well, D.C., of course, comes under federal jurisdiction, so he may have more leeway there. But last week, a federal judge in California did rule that Trump's deployment of the National Guard to Los Angeles in the summer was illegal. That could end up with the Supremes, but it hasn't done that. But I guess my point is that, unlike a dictator, he even if he wins at times in the courts, and he often loses, he is under legal constraint in a way that a dictator would not put up with.
Well, except that he isn't putting up with it. So there was a study by the Washington Post a few weeks ago that showed that of all the cases that have ruled against Trump, in about a third of the cases, he has violated the court decisions. And then in another fraction of them, he's just taking them up on appeal. And then he's stalling, he's providing fake facts to the courts. So he's actually not really putting up with it. So that's the part that has me worried because, if the courts were holding the line and said, Mr. President, there is a system for changing the laws and you have to follow that before you act like the laws don't apply to you. But in fact, Trump is not doing that. So, I really put off using the dictator word for quite a long time. And now I think it's really impossible to avoid it because the guardrails that are supposed to hold a president in place, keep him accountable, keep him following the law, are actually not functioning. And the big signal, the thing that maybe should have alarmed us, well, it alarmed a lot of us at the time, but the thing that's come true in ways that we couldn't really have imagined was when the Supreme Court said last July 2024, I should say, that Trump was immune from the operation of criminal law. And that has just meant that he can violate the law with impunity because he knows that he will never be held accountable. And now he's trying to extend this to all the people who work for him by saying, look, if you break the law, I've got your back and I'll pardon you. So this is kind of a criminal enterprise rather than a government at the moment.
Because he's not alone as presidents with dodgy pardoning. It's one of the most misused parts of the American Constitution, the founding fathers.
Unfortunately, we got this from the British Constitution,
Yeah,
so
but we don't use it in the way you misuse it. Pardoning is really, the Prime Minister has no power of pardon. And I tell you, if the King tried to exercise power of pardon, he wouldn't be King for very long.
I guess it's an issue. Democracy.
Well, one hopes so. We are one of the oldest. I guess it's an issue of nomenclature. As someone who did political science at university, not sociology, which is your field.
I used to teach political science.
Well, there you go. So we both have a political science background.
True.
In dictatorships, elections are not free and fair. The courts are not independent. There is no free press. There is no political opposition. America has all of the above.
Well, but here's the thing. So we can't get stuck in 20th century dictatorships. There's a new light touch dictatorship that's on offer now. So actually, I've come back to the US recently in terms of my field of study, but I lived and studied in Russia. I worked at the Constitutional Court there as Putin was taking it down. I lived and worked in Hungary when it was on the way up as a democracy. So you look at these countries around the world, and most of them are operating what I call soft dictatorships, which is that they still hold elections. Dictators don't cancel elections anymore. They just rig them. And the US is now in full-fledged election rigging mode as Trump's allies in the states are trying to gerrymander the districts to make sure that Trump's candidates win.
But gerrymander's as old as American democracy. It comes from the 19th century, from Governor Jerry.
Absolutely, we invented it, right?
Massachusetts, you invented all that.
We did.
You've always had this mad system where the states can determine their own boundaries.
True.
I put one thing, perhaps he would be even, it seems to me the media is doing its job. The courts are doing the job to the best of their ability. Perhaps he would be a bit more constrained and confined if the Democrats weren't so useless as an opposition.
True. Yes, all of us are looking at, why don't we have an opposition party? People have suggested here, why don't the Democrats put up a shadow cabinet, where you've got people who are actually responsible for tracking particular things the government is doing. All those things could be done, and the Democratic Party is hopeless. And part of that is that we have very, very weak parties in the US. And basically, our parties run on election cycles. The actual central machinery of the parties is more or less a campaign and fundraising machine. It's not.
You don't have a leader of the opposition.
We have no leader of the opposition. Exactly. And no one stood up. We're starting now. And my big hope for the US, frankly, is federalism, because we do now have several governors who are speaking out. We do now have, state
California, Illinois.
Exactly. And increasingly Maryland, and so on. The states' attorneys general. So we have these kind of justice ministers of the states that are bringing really effective cases so far in federal courts. But now they're
Pre-
looking at the state courts, which are much more independent than the federal courts right now. So it's not that
Professor, I'm going to have, sorry to interrupt you because I've enjoyed talking with you, but we're coming up to the news junction and we've run out of time. But I thank you for joining us. Kim Lane Scheppele, Professor of Sociology at Princeton University in New Jersey.